All right, hey everybody. My name is Hank Ketelsen, like Stacy said. Thank you for all showing up. I really, really appreciate it. We're going to talk today about making more than just pretty pictures, something that I try and make a big point of in my classes. We need to talk about intent. We need to talk about all these different aspects of photography. Today we're really going to focus on landscape photography and making more than those pretty pictures with that. Contemporary landscape photography has really lived under the shadow of the modernist movement. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Since the early and mid 1900s, with a common interpretation being that landscape photographers especially are kind of just working on the surface level, making pretty pictures like I said, or quote, an advertisement for nature. So, many contemporary photographers are working in ways that help bring forward local and global issues affecting our landscape. I believe the task of the contemporary landscape photographer is to inspire and inform change, document rights and wrongs, and create work that is more than just pretty pictures. We're going to say that a lot today, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself quite a bit. I repeatedly tell my photography students that intent is everything in art and photography. Okay? Intent shapes our work, makes us want to make more of that work, and be passionate about sharing it. A former instructor of mine always asked students, if you don't care about your photographs, why should I? And I think that that resonates throughout any work or any other work outside of art or photography or anything. But being informed and knowledgeable about your subjects will make your work stronger and more accessible to a wider audience. So I wanted to kind of start out. We're going to do kind of a little bit of a history lesson on landscape photography since really the 1850s up until contemporary times. And we're going to start with a photographer named Timothy O'Sullivan. Timothy O'Sullivan was born around 1840, they're not really sure, passed away in 1882. He started photographing under another famous photographer at the time, Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady was a photographer. You guys have probably seen Civil War portraits, a bunch of bodies laying on the fields and everything. One of the reasons they took photos like that was bodies didn't move. And shutter speeds were very, very long in that time, so you couldn't have moving subjects. So that's kind of one of the reasons they took those kind of photos. Anyway, he worked under Matthew Brady. And in that work, he became very, very good at field photography during the Civil War. And this led to give him a position with the geological exploration of the 40th parallel, the first government survey of the American West. Now, one of the things about shooting back in these days was, like I said, being a field photographer. What happened was, generally, this is what your backpack looked like. Instead of having a photo backpack where you could walk around, take some photos, go back, obviously much before digital, even this is before film. The way that you had to work was carrying around a bunch of glass plates that were the size of the images you wanted to make. You had to make the emulsion, which makes it light sensitive, in the field, and you had to shoot the picture before that emulsion dried or else it didn't work. So it was a lot of work to get this kind of stuff going. And you have no roads. You're usually on rivers or in the back of a cart like this, so glass plate negatives didn't survive some of these trips. So if you were very good at this, you were very sought after in the photography world. His images really show almost this kind of unspoiled West. I hate to say unspoiled, but it is kind of how it is perceived. He documented a lot of things before the mass migration of people coming from the eastern United States to the West. And he gives us a really good glimpse into these kind of vast landscapes that were going on at the time. So, another photographer at the time. Have you guys ever seen this image before? Anybody seen this before? Cool. So this is just a kind of a little tangent. We might have some tangents today too. I apologize for that. Eadweard Muybridge was a photographer working about the same time as O'Sullivan. This is just really interesting. I wanted to show some of his other photos as well, but this one I think is really important. He made a bet with Leland Stanford. Stanford University, if you guys ever heard about that out in California, obviously. Leland Stanford was the governor of California at the time, and he made a bet with a friend that horses when they are running, at some point, all four hooves are off the ground. And at the time, they didn't have a way to document this. They didn't have a way to actually see if this happened. That's why paintings of horses look really strange, sculpture and painting, because nobody knew what they looked like when they galloped. They could kind of look and then go, okay, I think I know what's going on, and draw it down. But Muybridge decided to actually figure out how to do this and had 24 cameras set up and had a horse run past them, and it tripped each camera. And you can see, where is it? Right here. You can see that the horse's hooves are all off the ground. So he helped Stanford win his bet. Stanford was very grateful to him and ended up funding a lot of his work forward, going off and making images like this of the California landscape. It's kind of hard to tell, but there is a person sitting right there. If you guys have never been to the Redwoods, I definitely recommend it. It's amazing. During this time, what was really going on was photography was being used as kind of fact-finding, exploration, documentation type of work. We do get a lot of beautiful images like this because obviously these are unspoiled landscapes, really beautiful. From that, at that same time, there was Sinus commercial work, some portrait work. That was kind of really where photography was at. But towards the end of the 1800s, artists started taking photography and really moving it forward and using it as a form of a new medium to work in. One of the first people to do that was Eadweard Steichen. Late 1800s, early 1900s. He worked in a way that we call pictorialism. And the way that that is it's kind of soft, it's out of focus a little bit maybe. You get this kind of sense of almost like impressionism. So the reason for that was that at the time, photography was not seen as an art form. Even today, we still have a debate whether photography is an art or not. A lot of people actually do not think that photography is an art. I completely disagree, obviously. But back then, in order to gain acceptance as photography started to gain traction, what they did was they would make photographs that looked like paintings, which is kind of strange, right? You get these photos that are soft. They do have really beautiful light. I think they're gorgeous, but it's not really taking cameras and photography where they should be, I think. This is one of his most famous photos. It's a little bright in here, but this is Moonlight the Pond. One of the most expensive photos ever sold at auction as well. It's gorgeous, wonderful photo. I love it. But by the 20s and 30s, many photographers were realizing that the camera was a tool that can render a scene in such minute detail that why should they be imitating another art form? Why not fully jump in with both feet and make photographic images as they believe they should have been seen? So a group of 7 photographers decided to form a group called Group F64. F64 refers to the aperture on a camera. I know most of you guys here aren't photo students. In the lens of a camera is a small little diaphragm. It controls how much light comes through the lens of the camera. The smaller that diaphragm is, the less light that comes through. But one of the benefits of it is that it also gives you really good depth of field, which means that everything that's in front of the camera, all the way to mountains that are way off in the distance, are all going to be nice and sharp and beautiful. Something that you can tell if I go back one slide, doesn't really look like that in this one, correct? So we can see here in an image by Imogen Cunningham, sorry. She was part of the group. It was started in the mid-1930s with the goal of creating, quote, straight photographs. They were sharp in focus from front to back. So obviously this is a little small image, but you guys can start thinking about the type of photography from this time. Gone was totally the look of pictorialism with this group. They wanted to really embrace everything that they could do with photography. Full tonal range from really bright highlights all the way down to the deepest, darkest blacks, just to get everything going on in there. Imogen Cunningham, I love her work. It's usually kind of this really almost kind of dreamy light, but not overly done like the pictorial style that we were just looking at. So it looks soft, but it's not. It's really the petals of the petals of the flower that are making this image feel like it's kind of soft, but it is razor sharp. So another photographer from this group was Eadweard Weston. He was kind of an interesting figure in this. He was just south of San Francisco in like the Carmel area, if you guys are familiar with that at all. He kind of stumbled upon this on his own in a way. He was living, like I said, in a small town called Carmel, California. All the big people that were working in photography that were starting to do this stuff were maybe in San Francisco, Seattle. Imogen Cunningham was in Seattle. New York, everything like that. There really weren't any photography publications at the time, not a lot of photography shows, but he started to realize that he really wanted to make these images that use the camera to its fullest advantage. He's quoted as saying, "The camera should be used for a recording of life, for rendering the very substance and quintessence of the thing itself, whether it be polished steel or palpitating flesh." And I think that's really important. You can see that he's trying to, do portraiture, landscapes. This is probably his most famous photograph, if anybody recognizes this. This is a pepper. And he would find these very, basically sensual-looking vegetables, objects, and photograph them like this. And this is, again, a complete departure from that pictorialism style, correct? So, but now we get into the big guns. If I was to ask you guys of who's probably the most famous American photographer you guys can think of?
Ansel Adams.
Thank you very much. So we get to Ansel Adams now. And he is really the embodiment of everything that is about Group 64, straight photography, everything about that modernist movement. Remember I talked about that at the beginning of this? This is whose shadow we've been living under as landscape photographers for, 100 and something years now. About 100 years. Originally training to be a concert pianist, his father gave him a camera on a trip to Yosemite when he was young, and he really kind of caught on with it. And around 1930, he just decided, you know what, I'm really good at piano. He was very good at piano, but I'm going to take off and start doing photography full-time and make a career out of it. He's most known for work dealing with the actual or perceived remaining untamed wilderness of the American West. He was one of the most vocal leaders for the conservation movement of the time, and his work was instrumental in creating awareness of our natural wonders to the greater public. So his work, I think you guys, these are probably not new images to a lot of you if you guys have seen posters and calendars and all that kind of stuff. This is one of his most famous photographs for sure. This is kind of an interesting photo. He saw this, I think he was leaving this town and kind of just looked over his shoulder and saw the sun was going down and was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a good photo. So he jumped out of his car. His car at the time actually had a platform on top of it, and he would crank down some jacks on the side and he would jump up on top of the car to get a higher vantage point. And he got up there and set up his camera. He's not doing wet plate stuff like what we were talking about before with the glass plate negatives, but he jumped up on top of the car, set up this camera that is still pretty bulky and hard to set up, and forgot his light meter down in the car. And he knew that if he went down to grab it, he wouldn't have enough time so he just kind of scrambled, set his settings on his camera, and he got this image. So this is kind of a fun photo when you kind of know the background to it. It's one of his most famous photographs. But if you read about this, there is this image, and then he changed the film. The next photo he took, it's all gone. And that's within like a minute or something like that. All this was gone, not even close to the same kind of image. So always be ready with your cameras. Lesson from that one. But one of the reasons that he was so successful in being able to capture this type of photo was he created this concept of pre-visualization. So what is pre-visualization? Pre-visualization is knowing where the light falls, how bright it is, how dark it could be, and knowing that if I set this up like this, it's going to be very bright here, very dark here, and I can manipulate this to be exactly how I want. And The system that he created for this was called the zone system, if anybody's ever heard of that in photography. It is an extremely technical process. If you get down into it really, really deep, it is basically, when you have a scene like this, you meter for your scene, just like you would do with any other photograph. Even your guys' smartphones have light meters in them. They don't just kind of just randomly take pictures. They have to meter how much light is going to be hitting the sensor, in this case film, in order to take the correct exposure. From that, he would meter for his shadows, he would meter for his highlights. Depending on the difference with that, he would adjust his development time, and that's how you get the Ansel Adams look with the zone system. So these are really heavily modified images in the darkroom. If you look online, you would be able to see like a straight just print from one of his negatives, and it's pretty dull. But then you see all the work that he does dodging and burning and all this crazy stuff, and then it turns into something like this. So this isn't something where he just snaps a photo, goes back, develops it, prints it, done, and you can just make as many as you want. Tons of time go into these type of images. So anyway, that's enough about the zone system. But from F64 all the way here, this is really that modernist movement. In photography, when somebody's talking about modernism, they really talk about black and white images, straight photography. You can see everything's in focus from these trees at the front to the mountain all the way in the back. And it's really showing nature as this grand, unspoiled, monolithic entity, right? We really get this kind of sense of, this is perfect, look at this, okay? While there isn't anything inherently wrong in this type of view, we need to acknowledge the role of humans in our environment. And that's kind of what started to happen around the 1960s. A lot of things were starting to go on in America. We had the civil rights movement. Vietnam was going on. We had the counterculture revolution. The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, was created in 1970. All these kind of things led to these photographers being collected to do this show called the New Topographics. It was in 1975, these 10 photographers down here came together to really start exploring, especially out west, the new kind of landscape that we had created, that we had affected. So these are the 10 artists right here. I do want to say Robert Adams is not related to Ansel Adams, so don't worry about that. But the first photographer we will look at is Robert Adams. And we start seeing images like this start to be made. It was really hard at the time to be able to kind of, go out into the wilderness and take a beautiful, gorgeous picture and then come back to this. Jeez. So we start getting scenes of having a beautiful landscape potentially in the background, having the foreground filled with some sort of human-made object. Okay? And there's really stark contrasts that we see. Here's another one of his images here, burning oil sludge north of Denver, Colorado in 1973. Again, we do kind of have that modernist kind of take on still making a beautiful image, right? We have our nice tones, we have nice shadows, we've got nice highlights. It's a really beautiful black and white image. But when we look at the subject matter, it's really shifted a complete 180 degrees from what we were used to looking at. Another photographer, Louis Baltz, he worked in the same area out here in the West, but he really took the building of new structures as a, really an affront to how he felt the West was being treated. This is Park Meadows, subdivision phase 2, lot 65 looking east. This was in 1983, but his photographs really embody this kind of, a lot of them have some nature in front almost, will have some sort of a structure and then a mountain or something in the background like this. Not saying it's formulaic in any way, but we do get a sense of there really isn't anything here that was here before we got there. Everything had been changed. One of the things I've noticed in a couple of these photographs that I've been looking at over the years, they'll show a subdivision, and even the road signs for the names for the roads don't even reference the place that they are, which I've always kind of felt is kind of strange. This is in Tustin, California. He photographed a lot of industrial type of complexes like this as well, and really breaking them down from these giant monoliths like we had for Ansel Adams with Half Dome or something like that, and replacing them with these new monoliths that we were placing all over the West. Another photographer from the new topographics. These are a husband and wife pair, Bernard and Hilla Becker. The Beckers were very, very famous, and they worked a lot in Germany as well. They were very famous for creating these, what they called typographies, where they would go and explore and find structures that were for the same purpose, and kind of removing them from their original locations in a way, and showing them almost as like specimens, right? So right here we have, this is called pit heads from 1974. I believe that these are the mechanisms which pull the carts and the miners out of the mines. I think the shafts go down at an angle and they bring them up like that. So it's really breaking them down into similar and completely different types of objects, right? Same thing for the coal bunkers over there on the right. Again, all different locations, but you start to see a lot of similarities to them. You see that they all kind of come down into a funnel like that. They all seem to have some sort of, I'm assuming, how it gets fed into the bunker. So there's a lot of these similarities that are found in completely different places throughout the West, or throughout the world. And it was an interesting look because you can see that we are basically just kind of replicating everywhere we go, taking these things and moving them to a new location. One other photographer from the new topographics that I'd like to talk about is Stephen Shore. He was the only one in the new topographics that worked in color. Now, color photography at the time in the 70s was really seen as something for just the general public and not for art. We were really starting to kind of get some traction as photography being accepted as an art form. And still a lot of people were saying, well, we'll accept it, but this color stuff doesn't work. That's for snapshots of your kids at their birthdays. So, so his work is very, very different from everybody else's work in the new topographics. You flip through the book. It's a wonderful book if you guys ever track down a copy of it, flip through it. But when you get to Stephen Shore's, you see downtown scenes of small towns throughout the West, and just the interaction more with people, and actually people in the photographs in the landscape. And I just love them, they're beautiful. So moving forward in time, some more time has gone by. And a lot of people are starting to realize that we kind of had this modernist movement. We had really the new topographics. Now what do we do? Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe had a great project called Yosemite in Time. And this is kind of the thing that I was talking about at the beginning, living under that shadow of modernism, was that they said in their artist statement, Yosemite Park has been considered by many artists to be restricted by its visual past. The Yosemite in Time project was an attempt to reopen the park to new visions by re-examining the old. So we do go to these places and you kind of look at them with fresh eyes, but even with those fresh eyes, we look at them and think, wow, like these pictures have really already been taken. So how can we kind of recontextualize these things and start moving forward with them? So they started doing a rephotographic project. And they started with something like this, where they would just go back to the exact same locations that photographers had been at, and they would rephotograph the same shot. And this one's from 2002. For the next couple ones, these will break down what we're exactly looking at, because the next ones, they get kind of small. But the one on the left here is a shot from Ansel Adams in 1940, and the one on the right is from 2002. And we can start to feel, not only with the modernist photos, we really have something that is timeless, right? that shot of the Tetons, Half Dome, any of those kind of things, we look at them and it really doesn't matter when they were taken. It's a beautiful image. When we start pairing them with these newer photos, we start to get that effect of time. And time is really, really important because we really need to see how the environment has changed and potentially how we have affected that change. So if we kind of move on, this one might be a little bit difficult to see way in the back. But Klett and Wolf started working with, instead of just rephotographing the exact same scene, they started making these almost panoramas out of the images. So they would sometimes start with this image over here by Muybridge, add on to it, and they'd sit there with their cameras and they'd have a reference photo and they'd get it as close as they possibly could to having the color images in the background be this panorama of the shot in order to include more photos over there by Edward Weston, which I believe is the smaller, it's kind of hard to tell. Nope. Ansel Adams is the smaller of the two right up here, and then Weston is down here in the bottom. And I like this one because it's Mark Klett and Byron Wolf swatting high country mosquitoes. So if you ever go to Yosemite, there's mosquitoes. It sucks. But you can see that we're starting to be able to really kind of compare these places. And that's really, really important. I love these series. There's so many of these. I wish I could just show you guys so many more photos, but it would take forever, and yeah. So moving forward even more in time, a photographer named Edward Bertinsky, he's from Canada. He has been working with doing color work like this with environmental issues for a very, very long time. This is from a series called Tailings. These are nickel tailings. Tailings are what is left over after metals have been processed. And a lot of times what happens is those tailings are just disposed of into the environment. So just by looking at this photograph, we can already kind of tell it looks a little strange because it doesn't look like lava, right? It's not bright and glowing. And we have this really barren landscape, so something is definitely off. Now obviously in the context of this series, we know that these are metal tailings. But pairing these two images together, it's just hard not to see how this is something that we can accept as something that's okay for our environment. That bright red, or excuse me, bright orange, it's just screaming basically caution, right? Also, we have this very black field back there. It looks like everything has been just completely devastated by what's going on here. Another image from this series is uranium tailings. This was also taken in Ontario, 1995. Again, kind of that just bleak landscape that we know just really has been affected by us. We can see across the top that that is a man-made embankment. You can see probably where it comes down over the side there, and we can just see the devastation that has been brought to this area by this. Now, one of the things that I really, really like about Bertinsky's work is that his work does not really kind of hit you over the head with facts and figures. He presents these as really these are almost open to interpretation, but it's a pretty narrow interpretation when you really get down to it. He's got an excellent documentary. I believe it's still on Netflix. It's called Watermark. I would highly, highly recommend you guys watch it. It's kind of like these photos. There is not much said. It seems like a great forum to have people talk about, well, this happened and then this happened, and when they put up the dam, this happened, and blah, blah, that kind of stuff. But I love this kind of subtle way of informing your viewers of something that's going on. So this is the Colorado River Delta near San Felipe in Baja, Mexico. There's definitely an issue there with the Colorado River spilling into the Sea of Cortez down there, and how much people are using it upstream that by the time it makes it to Mexico, there really isn't that much water left for everybody in Mexico or even further downstream in the United States. So we get images like this. We also have things like this where, I mean, it's such a stark difference between the left and the right here. And it's divided by the water that is being used to make this side so green. And this is in the Imperial Valley in central Southern California. And it's very strange, you know, it's so strange to fly over places, you know, the Midwest, even Central California, where you just see it's kind of just brown and then just these huge streaks of green. And it looks very nice, but there's so much going on down there that we need to address, especially with our waterways. Doing good on time. All right. Next photographer I'd like to talk about is Jamie Karayanis. I believe that's how you say it. I apologize if that's wrong. She created a body of work called Power. And I'm just going to read from her artist statement right here. It's a reference to the environmental, social, and economic impact of mountaintop removal on the nation's Appalachian Mountain region. Additionally, performance art and its use of photographic documentation are examined in relation to Power's use of performance. Through performance, I insert myself within the image to illustrate the impact of this mining process. So performance art, if you guys aren't exactly sure what that is basically putting yourself into your work to demonstrate something, right? So here we have a shot of the top of Black Mountain in Appalachia from 2013, and you can see the effects of the mining there. But I think that her most effective work that she made was these next two photos. This is Marsh Fork Elementary School in Sundial, West Virginia. And in the background back there is a slurry impoundment breach, which is basically a byproduct of mining. There's a lot of water involved. So they make these dams and put all that slurry behind these dams. These dams have a history of failing, and there's usually a lot of stuff behind them. And there's usually communities right down from where these impoundments are. So what she did, and it might be kind of hard to read right here, but this is called Flood Experiment. And it says right there, flood experiment conducted to understand how time and depth would coincide if Marsh Fork Elementary were to encounter mass flooding due to adjacent coal slurry impoundment breach. So basically she has right here, she says that she's 5'3" tall. She's got a marker that I believe is about 6 feet tall. And she has a time frame here from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, that within 30 seconds there'd be 1 feet of toxic sludge, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, and within 3 minutes there'd be 6 feet of slurry sliding down into the area where the school is sitting. And you can see that obviously she gets smaller and smaller as she goes down there. But it's demonstrating rather than just saying, you know, hey, if that dam breaks, the school gets destroyed. This is a much more powerful statement than just saying that in 3 minutes the school would be completely covered up. And how many people can actually get out in 3 minutes? That would probably be pretty difficult. And the last photographer we're going to talk about today is Jeff Rich. Now, Jeff Rich is working kind of in that same vein of the new topographics, working with how human-made objects are involved in our waterways. And he's also working in that way of Bertinsky in making images that almost speak for themselves. This is Foam from Pollution, the Pigeon River in Hartford, Tennessee. It's taken in 2007. And you can see that this beautiful whirlpool that has been put out there is actually made from the foam from pollution that is dumped into this river from upstream. He writes, by referencing the geography and the history of the French Broad River watershed through the lens of my own personal experiences with residents, this work highlights the interconnectedness of the area and ultimately focuses on the relationship between land, water, and man. So a watershed, if you guys aren't familiar with that term, is basically where, when you have a single point, like let's say the Green River right here, there is a greater watershed where we can basically say where the water, if it falls there, will run into that river. And that means that it's not just the river that we have to deal with, it's everything beyond that. It includes land, it includes commercial and industrial properties, and includes private properties along the river and adjacent to the river. And we can see things like here, the bank reinforcement, where some places this really isn't being treated very well. But he also brings in a lot of photography, a lot of photographs like this, where there is a really good connection with your environment in recreation, in tourism, in commercial and everything that is respectful of it, but also shows that people are trying to use this. And by using this, it is showing that interconnectedness between all of it. And this last photo here, this is Seth Freeman along the French Broad River in Marshall, North Carolina. Jeff Rich went to this spot. He knew that it was a private property. He parked his truck, climbed down, started taking a photo, and he started to notice that there was probably somebody behind him. And he looked behind him, and you know, as a photographer, I've had this happen to me. Somebody usually kind of approaches you and is like, so what are you up to, you know? So he basically explains to him his project and everything, and Seth Freeman turned out to be a very, very nice gentleman. Let him know that this property that that he owns, several acres right along the river right here, used to be open for camping. They decided to stop doing that. It was just getting trashed by way too many people. So they closed it down, and he's basically taken it over, and it's something for him and his family to enjoy. But every single time they started talking about something, Seth Freeman would start talking about something that was going on upstream. Somebody was always doing something that would affect him downstream. And that's the thing that I really want you guys to kind of take away from the environmentalist perspective of this, is that our landscape really reflects our ideals, our priorities, collectively and individually. And we all live downstream of somebody else's actions. So keep that in mind whenever you guys think about anything that is going on here locally, globally, anything. I do want to bring it back to one more thing here, and that is intent. When you guys do go take photographs, really think about why you're taking your photographs. Ansel Adams said, "There is nothing worse than a sharp picture of a fuzzy concept." And it goes back to that, if you don't care about your photographs, why should I care about your photographs? If you guys are going to make any kind of art, any kind of photography, really anything in your life, if you don't care about it, why should I? That's where I'm going to kind of leave you. And just remember, try to make more than pretty pictures. Think about what you're trying to say. And yeah, so thank you.